I call Julian Ginter.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker. Tēnā koutou te whare. I rise to speak on the third and final reading of the 2015 and 2016 estimates, the final reading in the budget debate. Mr. Speaker, the budget is all about priorities. It tells us what the government really values and what they think is important. And the Green Party believes that this budget is very much one of missed opportunity. It's the National Government's 7th budget, and it demonstrates that what they really value is protecting the status quo. There are 3 big economic challenges that are facing us in the long term, and that's what the Green Party wants to prioritize. Climate change, growing inequality, that's the gap between those who have and those who do not, and rebalancing the economy so that New Zealand is actually earning its way in the world. Now, I know that New Zealanders care about all of these, and in particular on climate change, they're already taking actions in their own lives. But unfortunately, the government is failing to make it easier for them to make the changes that need to be made for us to respond to climate change in the long term. I know New Zealanders want to live in a country that's fair, where everyone has the same opportunities, where we don't have a growing number of children growing up in poverty, which means they have fewer opportunities and they end up costing us more in the long run because they aren't able to fully participate in society. We have higher health costs, higher costs in terms of crime. So there are many, many reasons to address inequality, and I know New Zealanders value living in a fair country, and unfortunately our country is becoming less fair. And finally, rebalancing the economy is something that the National Party has promised to do. Bill English used to talk about it when they were first elected. They've completely failed to do that. Not only has the share of the economy that is exports failed to increase, it's actually fallen. We've seen the largest gap ever between growth in the non-tradable sector versus growth in the tradable sector. It's the largest gap since 2000. The current account deficit still at over $8 billion and forecast to increase in the coming years. So these are all things that I know New Zealanders care about, and that the Green Party has a clear plan and a set of solutions that would address all of these issues. But National has failed to address these issues. And I realize all 3 of these challenges were problems when National was elected. We had growing carbon pollution emissions back in 2008. We had huge growth in inequality in the past few decades. And of course, we had an even larger current account deficit when National was elected. But what they have failed to do is make progress on any of these issues, and it's because ultimately they are a party that's very much focused on protecting and preserving the status quo, not one that's going to actually respond to the challenges and create a cleaner, greener, fairer New Zealand in the long term. Very short-term focus. So what are the Green Party solutions that were not included in this budget? Well, firstly, to deal with climate change, we have a really clear set of solutions, because we know that we cannot continue to grow our carbon pollution forever. We're not going to be able to have an economy that thrives in the long term if we don't respond to climate change. And most of all, I know that New Zealanders care about their children and their grandchildren. They want them to live in a world with a stable climate, one where our economy can actually thrive even when we have a carbon-constrained world, which, the talks in Paris that are coming up at the end of this year, unfortunately, New Zealanders aren't going to have a target that we can be proud of. But most of all, we don't have a plan in this budget for how we would actually reduce emissions. So how could we reduce emissions? Transport spending is a first and obvious one. Without increasing the amount we're spending on transport, simply by redirecting it to the most productive, efficient projects, we can massively reduce our carbon emissions from transport. We could also reduce the costs to households and business of getting around the country. And we could also reduce our current account deficit, because at the moment we're spending over $13 billion importing vehicles and oil to run them. So if we had a more balanced transport system in our major towns and cities and between our cities, if we actually invested in the smart rail projects and busway projects, safe walking and cycling. I know finally the government is doing a little bit on cycling, but if we actually invested in those smart projects, we would save households and business money, we would save the government money, we would reduce carbon pollution, and we would reduce the amount that we need to sell overseas in order to pay for getting around. So it just makes sense. It's a smart green solution. In energy, we could have and should have a target of 100% renewable electricity generation in this country. It's entirely achievable, and we showed a fully costed plan in the run-up to the election last year how we could do that, and very small investments by the government in electric car charging infrastructure, for example, could help facilitate the switch to electric vehicles where appropriate. Our climate tax cut was the first of a change in tax structure that would start to put a price on pollution and return the revenue of that to households and business in the form of a tax cut. So it makes sense to tax pollution so we get less of it, and we can return that revenue to households so they actually get a tax cut. So it's just common sense stuff that this government could be doing, and yet they're failing to do. The next big challenge, also related, and the solutions are related, that the Green Party has proposed specific solutions to, is inequality. Look, we found out last week that 45,000 more children are living in poverty. That is a economic and moral failure on the part of this country. And there's some simple practical solutions that we could take that would help reduce the gap in inequality. One of those is dealing with the housing problem in Auckland. By putting in place a capital gains tax, we start to address the imbalance. Right now there's a loophole. We want to close the tax loophole on housing so that we get investment in the productive sectors of the economy rather than just in housing. But that would also help achieve more affordable housing. That's not the silver bullet. There are a lot of other things we have to do. Introducing protection for tenants and renters is something we're very far behind on in this country. And it makes sense to look after tenants. That also helps address the housing affordability issue, both from the perspective of renters and those who are looking to buy. And it ensures that people have access to warm, dry, secure housing, which surely is a human right and one that makes economic sense. We also proposed our school hubs plan, which looked at ensuring that there was a nurse in low decile 1 schools, and low decile schools would all get a coordinator to ensure that kids are receiving the social assistance that they have a right to receive. And it would put kids at the heart of our education policy, but also our social policy, and creating a hub which has been demonstrated overseas to work really well. It doesn't cost a lot of money, and it has huge social benefits. Ensuring that children in low decile schools have enough to eat, that they aren't going hungry. Not only do we want breakfast in low decile schools, but lunches, hot lunches. It makes sense because kids can learn better when they have access to food. And really, it's something that all of our children should have a right to. So, additional things to deal with inequality would include raising the minimum wage, so we'd stop subsidizing low-wage employers, and extending the in-works tax credit to beneficiaries, because every kid deserves to have the right, whether their parents are in work or not in work. So by addressing the housing issue, by looking at the form of urban development in the cities that have the most growth going on, that's Christchurch and Auckland, we could we could address multiple challenges with a few solutions, win-win solutions. So we could reduce pollution and reduce emissions, and we can reduce inequality through some of these practical, proven policies that are being implemented in successful economies overseas. We'd be looking after our people, looking after our environment, but most of all, it just makes economic sense. And all of the policies that I just cited do go quite a long way to helping with the rebalancing of the economy. So we aren't so overly invested in just a few simple commodities that ultimately we're on this roller coaster as we are right now with the slump in dairy prices. Having a more diverse economy, additional policies that help with that are investment in research and development. We're very, very underinvested in this country in research and development, and putting a price on pollution is part of taking that first step to ensuring that we have a balanced, cleaner, greener future, that polluters are paying the cost of the pollution that they are putting out there, and that households and businesses are better off and have more opportunities to thrive in the long term. The Green Party has a very practical, costed vision, and we're giving voice to those New Zealanders who are already making changes in their own lives to deal with the long-term challenges which the National Party is absolutely failing to deal with. So we want to see action on climate change. We want a fair New Zealand with reduced inequality. And ultimately, if we address those issues, we're going to have an economy that is thriving globally. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.